Me every time. So here we go. Go ahead.
Well, welcome to Archaeology and the Exodus. I am L.S. Baker Jr., and tonight we're going to be looking at the topic about how the tent sanctuary, the wilderness sanctuary, was constructed. This actually, I just want to give you a fair notice up front. This was my dissertation topic for my PhD, so I have way more to say about it than probably is even on the screen, and I probably have way too much on the screen. So I'm going to go fast, and maybe in the future you can go back and look at them, look at the screens a little more closely, and get more information if you want that. I'll just try to cover maybe the basic of it so we can get through it all tonight. I do want to tell you that the topic of the sanctuary, as I grew up in the church, I grew up as my dad was a pastor, both grandfathers were pastors, heard about the sanctuary a lot, and really for me it was quite boring. I didn't find it interesting at all. I understand salvation is interesting, but you just hear the same thing over and over again. I actually was very interested in the sanctuary only in as I had already studied the archaeology of the Exodus, and for my dissertation, I needed something new. And so I thought, well, I've done the first half of the book of Exodus. I might as well do the next half and kind of really get really good at the whole book of Exodus. And so that's what I did, and it turned out really, really well. I did it as my MA thesis. Began it there in England in University College London. They actually encouraged me to do the sanctuary there, which was, it's a secular college, but they said, you know about the Bible, you know about archaeology, put that together. And they were very open for me doing it, which I was really pleased with. I learned a lot from them in the process of that. And then my PhD just continued on with the topic. And I wanted to just explore two things. I wanted to see if the 9 materials used in the construction of the sanctuary were all available at the time of the Exodus. The Bible describes them. I'll show you that in a minute. And I wanted to see if they were. Tonight, I'll answer that question for you. And I also wanted to see about the design of the sanctuary. Is it patterned after something on earth that they would have recognized? And I found that it was. The title of this presentation is Yahweh's Army Camp, and maybe that will give you a clue to where the parallel actually was. And I'll show you that in a minute as well. But we always like to start with a quote. This one comes from actually the god Amun himself speaking to Hatshepsut, obviously in a text composed by priests. He said to Hatshepsut, may you build a house, may you embellish a sanctuary, and may you consecrate my godly place. The idea of a sanctuary, the idea of a temple or a tabernacle was not new with the Hebrews or with the sanctuary, with the wilderness at Sinai. It was a concept the ancient world was very familiar with. And so that's a theme you're going to see tonight. God using something that you're familiar with to help explain a heavenly concept that's much, much bigger. And so we'll see that tonight as we go through and see how this tent sanctuary was constructed. We've already talked about the time period many nights. That first night we did that. We're talking about the new kingdom of Egypt. Every theory, every position agrees on that. We're talking about the northern part of Egypt. That was an important part in my dissertation because they came from the northern part. How much does that influence them? Building 2 military camps, military supply camps being around the army, how much would that have been an influence? I think Amenhotep was the pharaoh, but this really doesn't matter because for tonight's topic, because the army that was used in the new kingdom for Tutmos and Amenhotep was the exact same army style used by Ramses. In fact, Ramses' grandfather, the first Ramses, was a general in the 18th dynasty's army. And he was made pharaoh, so the army tradition just kept on going with Ramses. There was not much of a change for the content. So it doesn't matter who the pharaoh of the Exodus is. All of this is very relevant tonight. This, of course, happened at the end of the plagues. They got out, and of course, the army chased after them. So that's really kind of in our back of our minds as we think about the Red Sea crossing, one of these 5 places on the map with those green circles. I believe it was here, but there's many other good people that believe it's one of these other places. It doesn't really matter where the Red Sea crossing was. Everybody agrees that they went to Mount Sinai after that. Obviously, that's where they built it at. So whether Mount Sinai is here or whether it's over here at Jebel Luz, one of these 2 places is where they built the sanctuary. I believe it actually was here, but I'm not going to force you to agree with me, just letting you know what I believe. All right, so let's look at an overview real quick. Not everybody's familiar with the terminology and some of the things, so let me just run you through a quick. When I say the word sanctuary, I'm referring to everything. It's a sacred space. It means everything from the perimeter barrier all the way in. When I say the word tabernacle, I'm referring just to the central structure, the holy place and the most holy place inside the tabernacle. The most holy place was designated by space behind the veil. In front of the veil, it was the holy place, but it's all part of the tabernacle. So when I say those words, at least you know what I'm talking about. Sanctuary, I'm referring to everything. Tabernacle, I'm referring just to the central structure itself. Here's a drawing that I've done on this, so you kind of get an idea from an Egyptian kind of style of it. You'll see this at John Peckham, professor here, now moving to Adventist Review, just wrote a brand new book called God with Us. It's an introduction to Adventist theology. He takes all the 28 fundamental beliefs and writes them in a way that can be understood by undergraduate students. So it's an easy read. It's not meant just for school. It's meant for everybody. So if you're interested in that, by the way, it's not Sabbath yet. So let me tell you, there's a pre-order discount, 15% that's available online at Andrews University Press. So if you want that book, now would be a good time to get it because it's cheap. It's cheaper. But anyway, you'll see this drawing in that book. I did this drawing for that book. But this whole thing here is the sanctuary, and this central structure right here is I'm calling the tabernacle, with the holy place being here and the most holy place being there. All right, so a top-down view kind of gives you some of the same kind of ideas. I'm going to use this image right here a lot to kind of give you an idea. We're looking top-down like the Egyptians would do, with the gate here coming into the bronze altar, the laver, the screen going into the tabernacle itself, which is this here, and going into the holy place where you have the lampstand, the table, the golden altar. Then you have the veil here with the holy place here, and the ark. So you kind of get an idea of those things. So I'm going to be talking about tabernacle. I'm going to be talking about furnishings, and there's 6 different furnishings, and you're probably mostly familiar with that already. God said to Moses in Exodus 25:8-9, and let them make me a sanctuary. That means sacred sanctuary means sacred space. Let them make me a sacred space. Let me build them a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. The dwelling is that kind of a tabernacle. In fact, the word tabernacle is used, that I may tabernacle among them. So the word tabernacle means dwell. So make a sacred space so that I can tabernacle. And those are the words that we're going to be using. According to all that I show you, that is the pattern, and we're going to get back to that pattern in a minute, of the tabernacle and the pattern of the furnishings. So he's distinguishing 2 different elements. One is the tabernacle, the structure itself, and the other element is the furnishings. So we're going to treat those 2 things separately as we kind of work through it tonight. We'll kind of integrate them, but you'll see that we're treating them a little bit separately. And so what it tells us is that there's this wilderness sanctuary, this tent sanctuary, is a sacred space, but it's also a royal domestic space, because he's their king. Not only is he their God, but he's also their king. And so we're looking at those 2 elements, and I did that in the Egyptian context, and I'm not going to bore you with all statistics and all that tonight. I'm not going to skip over, but just know that that's what I was looking at. And then something very interesting. Most people skip over this part, but I think it's one of the most important elements. It actually was one of my professors in England that talked about the kind of pushing me towards a certain area of this. But look at this text. It's all from Exodus 12. There's 3 different verses in Exodus 12 that mention armies. Now, let me remind you that Exodus 12 is the Passover chapter. Chapter 12 is where the instructions about getting ready for the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Passover happens, and then they travel out of Egypt, and it's recalling that here and here. And in each case, it calls them armies. But remember, they're slaves. They've never fought at all. In fact, we just read it last night that God didn't want to take them north, because if they saw war, they might go back to Egypt, because they're not soldiers. And yet he calls them armies here. So let me read it to you. It says, so you shall observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread, for on the same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. That's verse 17. On the same day, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. On that same day, the Feast of Unleavened Bread starts. I'll bring your armies out of Egypt. It came to pass, in verse 41, the last part, that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. And then in verse 51, and it came to pass on the very same day, that very same day, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the one that was promised, the Lord brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt according to their armies. It mentions armies. And also Numbers chapter 2, the first to the second and the third verse, says, every one of the children of Israel shall camp by his own standard. I'll show you what an Egyptian standard looked like, beside the emblems of his father's house. They actually had emblems, just like the Egyptians did. They shall camp some distance from the tabernacle of meeting. That's the sanctuary with the tabernacle in the middle. On the east side toward the rising sun, those of the standard of the forces of Judah shall camp according to their armies. And then if you keep reading, it'll mention every single one in chapter 2 of Numbers, every single one of the tribes shall camp according to their standard, their flag, their standard, not really a flag, it's a standard. according to their armies. It says armies over and over and over and over and over again in Numbers 2. So it really gives us an idea that they're camped according to their armies. So here's the sanctuary. Here's the tabernacle in the middle of the sanctuary. I made it kind of bigger so you kind of can see it with the furnishings. But you can see Judah on the east, then Issachar, Zebulun. On the south were Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. On the west, Ephraim, Manasseh, Benjamin, and then Dan, Asher, and Naphtali north. Those are all the armies. And then the Levites were to camp in between the armies and the sanctuary, with Moses and Aaron on the east, the Gershonites in the south, Merarites in the west, Kohathites on the north. And this is what an Egyptian military standard looked like. This is a serpent standard. Dr. Baldwin, who used to teach here at Andrews University, had this really nice theory. I don't know if it's true or not, but he went back to the last couple of chapters of Genesis. You remember where Jacob is blessing and sometimes cursing his sons? And he calls them, oftentimes identifies them by an animal. You know, you are like an ox, you are like a lion, that kind of thing. Judah like a lion, of course. And so he suggested that maybe lion was the standard for Judah. Maybe Reuben was the standard of a man. You read it in that part of chapter of Genesis. Ox for Ephraim, and Dan a snake. This is what a snake would look like, a standard. So they're military standards, and they're camping by armies. It's very interesting. So that puts the sanctuary actually in a military context. And that military context is going to be probably the most important context for us as we go through tonight. I mentioned this already, but Exodus 25, 1-9, God specifically asks them to bring an offering. And he says he wants everyone to give it with a willing heart. That's very familiar to us as Christians. And there's 9 materials he asks for. He asks for gold, silver, and bronze. Those are the metals. Blue, purple, and scarlet thread. Fine linen, goat's hair. Those are the textiles. Ram skins dyed red, and something called taha skins. How that's translated is unique. I'll show you the different translations tonight and what I think it is. And then the last one is a certain kind of wood called acacia wood. I'll talk about all 9 materials. I wanted to know if they were all available, because if they're not all available at the time of the Exodus, then we have a problem. But I'll show you what I discovered tonight. These are those, and so I'm going to leave this this is going to be my standard tonight. I'm going to put a check mark, I guess, as we go through each of these, as you look at them tonight. Let's start with the Egyptian influence. Talked about the army, and these are the 2 questions I'm trying to answer tonight. We'll answer both of them. So let's do the design first. The Egyptian design, what design did an army camp look like? And was it anything like what we might see? Actually, it's actually Dr. Yonker that actually showed me this. We went down to Abu Simbel. This is a very famous one. Remember where they had to move the whole temple up elevation higher because they're going to put the Aswan Dam in and create Lake, what they call it Lake Nasser. And this would have been buried under the water. And so they saved it. And you can still go today and see the rescue. I think there's a big PBS special on that. I think they did a nice job of reconstructing it. But you kind of get an idea of, you'll walk in through the statues. There's 4 statues sitting down. There's right in between the 2 middle ones, the door that goes in. And then there's these 8 statues with pillars as you go back into the hypostyle hall, and then the sanctuary itself with all the 4 statues in the back. There's some side rooms all around. But what we're going to do is I'm going to take you in. We want to go to the right, and then over on this wall back over here, there's something very special. So here it is here, going in, turning right, and right over here is the Ramses attack on the Battle of Kadesh. And I want to show what that looks like. Here's a line drawing of it right above the first door there. You kind of actually see the whole battle here. I'm not going to go through the whole battle, but right here is Ramses' military camp laid out in a rectangle. Let me show you a blown up version of that. I don't know if you can see it very well, but the blown up version has it's a kind of a rectangle. The shield, they're using shields as kind of like a fence all the way around. And then their armies are all camped. You can see they have tents here and here. They're doing some training. Here's an actual pet lion. It actually says it's a pet lion. I don't know why they had that with them, but there it is. They had the horses all lined up here. They're getting ready to eat. They're training, doing different things. And then on this side of the camp, the Hittites are breaking in and attacking. And so they're attacking the camp on the right side. And that's kind of portraying what happened. They were at peace, and the Hittites just attacked their camp. Interestingly, this same image appears in other places. It appears at Luxor, the Luxor temple. It also appears at Abu Simbel. It's also at Karnak, actually, on that wall that I'm working on. It's actually on that wall kind of behind some of the later images. But something you can notice that no matter what you look at, they're all the same thing. So look at that red circle, for example. That red circle has a at Abu Simbel has a man carrying two things between two tents. We see it here, see it there. It's the same thing. You see the same images every single time. There's the lion every time. They're all in the same, basically the same places doing the same things. So in other words, what you're seeing represents an actual event. And this actual event, these are the things that were happening in that camp, and they're using a template in all these different places, which is kind of cool. But let's go back to the military camp because I want to show you something about this camp. You probably noticed it already, but in the middle of this camp, kind of to the right side, there's this central structure of some kind. This actually is Ramses' camp. It's actually Ramses' tent. And in Ramses' tent, I'll kind of colorize it so it's a little easier to see. The tent itself is here. He has a perimeter barrier around his tent, and then he has some officials here as well that are also camped there inside of his tent with him. In this longer spaced room, there's these captives all doing the worshiping towards this inner room. The inner room has a canopy. That's probably his actual tent. And in that tent, instead of having him, it has this box with two winged creatures. And the middle of those winged creatures is Ramses' name in a cartouche because he was their god king. Dr. Yonkers showed us this, and he said this would be a good dissertation for somebody to do, and so I did it. What is going on here? It looks, if you didn't know better, it looks an awful lot like the sanctuary. So I looked at that and I said, well, let me do a comparison with, this is the Egyptian military camp. Let me do a comparison with Assyrian camps and see what the design elements, maybe all camps in the ancient world look like that. Well, actually they don't. Assyrian camps, whether it's Sargon or Sennacherib, Assurbanipal, they all are circular. They all have different style tents. You can see their king's tent always has like an opening there. It's very much different. Over here, somebody's actually peeking out of the top. There's always some kind of a worship thing happening inside. You kind of can see it's always circular. It's very much different. They're circular tents, not rectangle. So the Assyrian is much, much different. I actually used this to argue in a recent conference about the Pentateuch and the dating of the Pentateuch, that the composition of Exodus must be early, because there's no way you can be in Assyria and compose Exodus late, like a lot of biblical scholars want to say, because otherwise it would be a circular structure. And we're looking at a rectangular structure. It's very Egyptian looking. So we can be very confident that it is an Egyptian structure we're looking at. And let's go piece by piece as we go through this now. The courtyard barrier, it actually starts with it's a perimeter barrier. It's 5 cubits high. So if you're thinking about it, it's about 8.5 feet high. 8.5 feet high is taller than most of us, which means if you're on the outside, you won't be able to see what's happening on the inside. You will be able to see the tabernacle because the tabernacle is taller than that, but everything else you can't see. You'll be able to see the smoke arising out of from the altar here, but you can't actually see what's happening. The tabernacle itself was about 17 feet high, so you see the top at least of that. The gate is the only one entrance. It's blue, purple, and red. It actually, we can look at it this way. You can see it's been embroidered over here, and that's how you get in. But the gate is very, very wide. It's obviously not trying to keep anybody out. It's only made of, the whole thing is made of linen. It's not actually keeping people out physically. It's not like it's a wall made of stone, but it's something that almost protects you. It almost organizes, as if God wants you to organize in your worship of him. He doesn't want people coming from anywhere, but they actually have an organization to worship. And I thought that was very, very interesting. I could say a lot more about it, but for time we'll go on. Linen is one of those, it was made out of linen. The gate and the courtyard perimeter itself are both made out of linen. This is actually linen in the New Kingdom. It's what it'll look like. They actually would bleach it white so it would look really, really clean. The very fine linen was saved for the very wealthy. We can imagine that's probably what was used. Linen is made out of flax plants. Here's some flax plants here. Linen was used actually for a lot of different things in the sanctuary, and we'll get to those in a few minutes. But I do want to point out something. This is how they stored linen. They stored linen in a box. Actually, when my wife met me, I didn't use an iron very much for my clothes, and she would always chase me around with an iron. I have to be, if I'm gonna go on a date with her, I have to have my clothes ironed. So she made me very culturally proper. But I did want to remind her, as I learned this, that the ancient Egyptians valued wrinkles, because wrinkles were a sign of wealth. Because if you had a second pair of clothing stored in a box, of course it was going to have wrinkles on it. And that meant that you had more than one clothing. That meant you were rich. And so in some ways, I guess I could say that I was maybe a little bit wealthy. I had multiple shirts, but I also was kind of lazy because I didn't iron them. I learned how to do that better. But by the way, the word in the Pentateuch, all throughout the Pentateuch, is the Hebrew word shesh, which actually is an Egyptian loan word. If you go to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and you read about linen, even Esther, you read about linen, it's a Persian loan word, which of course you expect because it comes from the Persian period. Well, the scholars who suggest that the Pentateuch was written at the time of the Persians, after the Babylonian captivity, have to somehow explain why there's an Egyptian loan word here when the Persian loan word is used over at the other ones. So I think this is a very good indication, along with some other indications. I won't mention this every time, but I just want to point this out. It happens over and over and over and over again throughout the book of Exodus and in fact, the tabernacle itself. So it looks like Exodus was composed very, very early. There was embroidery on that gate. The embroidery was made of 3 colors of thread: blue, purple, and scarlet thread. It's actually, that's new technology. Red dye for threads was introduced in the 18th dynasty. So just before the Exodus, they had red dye for threads for the first time. In fact, they only individually dyed threads for the first time in the New Kingdom, in the 18th dynasty. Before that, they didn't dye threads. They would weave the garment in whatever the garment they wanted. Then they would dye the entire garment, because thread is it's made of flax, so it's very cellulose. And the dyes don't stick very well because it's kind of waxy. It doesn't stick very well. But they learned a technique. So by the New Kingdom, by the 18th dynasty, they actually could dye thread. So that was a brand new technology. And it was used to decorate 4 different parts of the sanctuary. Those 3 different colors, by the way, I went and looked at the jewelry from Tutankhamun, and I found, you can see it on the screen, the same 3 colors. Whenever you see the color green, it's actually blue. It's been faded over time, but it's those same 3 colors because those 3 colors were used. Blue represented divinity. And you see it on the ceilings of temples where they put stars of the gods, because that was the realm of the gods. Blue is the realm of the gods. So the cosmic gods are all blue. Amun is colored blue. His whole body is colored blue. It means divinity. Purple is represented by this darker lapis lazuli color. It's kind of a dark blue. We would call it dark blue. They call it purple. It represents this. It represents royalty, because royalty is a combination of 2 colors. You know, purple is a combination of blue and red. And since the king was both divine and dangerous, that's what made a king a king, because red represented danger. We talked about this last night. They painted their doors red to keep the supernatural forces out, because it was a dangerous color. The red lands, the Red Sea, those are all dangerous areas because they're outside of Egypt, the Black Lands. This actually is a embroidery of Amenhotep, the pharaoh who I think was the pharaoh of the Exodus. Embroidery in the New Kingdom was only used for royalty. So in other words, when the Hebrews came to the gate of the sanctuary, the perimeter barrier, and they saw embroidery, they would have seen 3 colors that were exclusively used for a king, and they would have seen embroidery, which they know was only used for a king. So immediately they know that beyond that gate, inside that gate, is their king. It would have been automatic for them. God used a language they would understand, automatically they would have understood that. Also, a new technology in the early 18th dynasty were these vertical looms, up to 5 meters tall, allowing them to make very, very long tapestries. Of course, the perimeter barrier is very, very long, and so it's 100 cubits on each side and 50 on both sides. So it's a lot of cloth. And they did all this embroidery, they did all this weaving, everything at Mount Sinai. We know that from the text itself. The tabernacle, so let's move on now in a bit. The tabernacle is all this structure here. And the tabernacle, if we were gonna talk about it, we would say maybe this blue structure around here is like the perimeter barrier that the sanctuary had. The green barrier here, not drawn really to scale, seems to be a barrier around a tabernacle, some kind of a structure, central structure. We would call this second barrier, maybe that tabernacle structure, and these would be the holy and most holy places type idea anyway. And so you can see that really clearly there, that there's actually something around it that we would call the tabernacle. So The tabernacle actually was not a rectangle. It actually was just not a semicircle, but it had two sides and an end on it. It was made of boards that were 10 cubits high. There's 20 boards to a side. Each board was 1.5 cubits wide. That made the entire sides 30 cubits. There's 8 boards on the back, each 1.5 cubits wide, and that meant the back was 12 cubits wide. So the sanctuary was 30 by 12 by 10, which meant that it was about 51 feet long, about 20.5 feet or so wide, and about 17 feet high. It was made of boards with 5 bars. Each of these bars, this one going through the center, this one went through the middle of the boards, and then there's 4 others on each end with rings kind of holding them. And these aren't rings like the rings of a finger, but they're rings more like a can. If you would cut both ends off of a can, that's how the Egyptians did rings, and they put their poles through that, which is much more secure, as it wouldn't allow too much give. So basically, what you have is a very simple, almost ingenious way of building this. You put this middle bar through first, and then of course these boards are going to move. But if you put these other bars on it on the outside, it's like it has it here, they'll be locked in place and they won't move. Furthermore, each board has 2 sockets. Remember when we were kids, there used to be a game we used to play out in the playground. I haven't seen one recently, but it was called tetherball. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's a pole stuck into the ground with cement, a cement cylinder in the ground, and then it had like a string with like a volleyball on it or something. The idea was you try to wrap the volleyball around in your direction until you got over to the pole, and then you won. And the other side is trying to hit the other way, and you're going back and forth. Well, that pole was on this, sunk into the ground with a weight of concrete. The cylinders, these sockets that they're called in New King James, in the ancient Egyptian, they made them just like that concrete in the ground, except that God used silver for weight. Imagine almost all the silver that was given, almost all of it was used for weight that no one's going to see because it's going to be buried in the ground. This putting it together would let the Hebrews really realize how precious and valuable. By the way, all these boards overlaid with gold. The ancient Egyptians did that a lot. They used acacia wood and they overlaid it with gold. Acacia wood, by the way, another Egyptian loan word. Acacia wood was very popular in Egypt. There's many different varieties in ancient Egypt. Acacia nilotica is the species that they used for the long boards on their boats. They used it in construction. They built frames and houses and things. They use this long because it grows to be long. It's actually one of the only species that's long enough to be 17 feet long. So we're pretty sure that's the species that was used for it. And that species of acacia that grows in the Sinai isn't tall enough for it. So they probably, remember, they were building these two cities. They probably took materials that they had already cut that they were going to be used. They probably brought them out with them. I guess they brought them out with the idea that they were going to use them for their own houses. I mean, why go all the way to the promised land and cut down more trees and make more lumber when you've already done the work? Just take the work with you and use it for your house. And so when God asked for an offering, I imagine that he was asking for them to give up parts of their house, give up part of your labor and give that to me for my house. And they were very willing to do it. In fact, the text says they gave so many offerings, they had to tell them to stop. Pastor, how great would that be? That's amazing. Anyway, that's how the sanctuary, the tabernacle itself was built. But there's also in the sanctuary there's a veil. This veil is a very interesting thing. It was made entirely out of linen. I've always believed that it was a curtain. I don't think most of us have thought anything differently than a curtain. It was hung on 4 pillars, and it separated the holy place from the most holy place. There was a theory I came across in my research that maybe this was a canopy, which of course is still a curtain, but it's a canopy that defines the space inside of the most holy place. Dr. Roy Gain, who was on my committee, he teaches Levitical studies. He teaches cult and the sanctuary. Dr. Davidson as well. They were very pleased with this idea because the sanctuary itself was 10 cubits tall, but it was 12 cubits wide. For it to be a perfect square for the most holy place, which is a very important concept, a 10 cubit by 10 cubit by 10 cubit canopy would provide that. And it would also allow you to still have a curtain going across, but it's much more stable. 4 pillars going across, there's no indication of how they kept it from falling forward or backward if it was a curtain. It could have been, though. It could have been a curtain. There's nothing it could be. But in Exodus 40, verse 21, I'm looking right here, and Numbers 4, verse 5, it says the ark was to be inside the veil. It was to be under the veil. This is it from the Hebrew. There's no way for it to be under the veil unless the veil was a canopy. It can't be inside the veil unless the veil is a canopy. It can be behind the veil, but being behind the veil can be the canopy or the curtain. It can be either way. I don't have an axe to grind either way. I've drawn it as a veil, as a canopy here, but it could be a curtain. And if you believe it's a curtain, I actually am not 100% sure it was a canopy. Nobody can be, because for some reason, God didn't give us the dimensions. He didn't tell us how big the holy place was. He didn't tell us how big the most holy place was. The best we can do is go to Solomon's temple and try to get it from there and come back. But Solomon's temple was so different in dimensions that it's hard for us to really do that. But that's where we basically try to get the idea. It was the most holy place in Solomon's temple was a perfect square. So this gives us that concept here. Some of the professors at Andrews were quite happy with that. I'm okay with it. And so I'm going to tell you, but the most important thing, though, the thing we should understand, it was also made of linen, and it was also embroidered with cherubim. And I'll come back to those cherubim in a minute. But again, that embroidery tells you that your king is inside. And that's a very important thing. There were canopies in ancient Egypt. They used it a lot. They used it for, you can see here, a frame that used for canopy. They used it for Tutankhamun's burial. Remember these Easter egg kind of thing, that kind of the Russian nesting doll kind of idea for Tutankhamun's tomb. I showed you that a few nights ago. But they also had canopies. She's kind of shrouds that kind of went over. You can see also in iconography, quite often you'll see canopies, sometimes with a pillar, sometimes without a pillar. But there's always this concept in sacred spaces of this. And you also saw that, by the way, in Ramses' tent in the Battle of Kadesh. So I'm going to draw it here just for the purposes of designating where the most holy place was. But it could be just a plain curtain going across, or it could also be a canopy. So it has both of them. So I put it there so you kind of get an idea what it looks like. Let's go back out to the front of the tabernacle. The front of the tabernacle had a screen on it. The screen had 5 pillars and a screen in the front. We're not told how tall the pillars are. We're not told how big the screen is, but we are told that the screen was also embroidered. It may be the size of everything else. We're not sure. It is interesting, though, if you look at temples in ancient Egypt, going back to the very, very earliest ones, they all had these, what we call them flagpoles here with a little flag on it. Here's actually, this is actually from the temple at Luxor, and it's actually illustrating the temple of Luxor. And you can, I don't know if you can see it here, but there's these tall flagpoles with the flag, kind of, it's not really flags, they're more of just a banner. But the Egyptian word for God was a flagpole, or the pole with a banner off of it. That's actually the hieroglyph word for God. And so that's what they put in front of their temples. I don't know whether God used it to be tall like this or not. I've drawn it tall. I've only done that simply because there has to be a way for the smoke to get out of the tabernacle. But I'm not sure. I just drew it this way. You can imagine it smaller if you want. This could actually even be smaller. It doesn't have to be all the way up to the top. I put it all the way to the top. It doesn't have to be. Then the tabernacle itself was covered with 4 covering layers. I didn't actually realize this, but the first inner layer was also made of linen. It actually was composed of 2 sets of 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then another set of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 going off the back. And then they were latched together with clasps made of gold loops and gold clasps, 50 of them tied together. So these strips were sewn together with, by the way, blue thread was woven all the way around the border of all these ones, and all of them were embroidered with cherubim. This was the thing you would see. So if you actually came into the sanctuary, the tabernacle itself, and you looked up, this is what you would see. You'd see the linen. Look to the right or the left, you'd see a gold wall, because it's gold overlaid with acacia wood. In front of you, you'd see the veil. whether it's a curtain or a canopy, doesn't matter. You'd still see it. It's right there. And then behind you would actually be the screen, also made of linen. So that was behind you is linen, above you is linen, and in front of you is linen with gold on both sides. So you kind of get a concept of, remember, this is 17 feet tall, by the way. So this is a big space. You kind of get this whole idea. Well, the linen was a beautiful layer. It also reminded them of the king and all those other things we talked about already. Over top of the linen was a goat's hair layer. Goat's hair layer also was woven, but this one also sets of 5, but this one had an extra 6th curtain, but only a half size of it that was supposed to hang over the front. It was also made of clasp. This time, the clasp was made of bronze. This goat hair layer was the utilitarian layer. It was the layer that was going to bear the weight of the layers above it, but it completely covered the linen layer. So here I have the linen layer laid out and the goat's hair layer laid on top of it. So you got an idea. And each of these, the way that it's described, there's no seam that actually touches any other seam going across except for where it might overlay there. So it actually is a beautifully designed structure so that it's made right. By the way, this is goat's hair. It's from the Ptolemaic period, the time of the Greeks, time of Cleopatra. But you got an idea of what goat's hair looks like. Tents are made this way. If you happen to come to Andrews University sometime and visit our museum, you'll see a goat's hair tent. Because Bedouins today, Bedouins throughout history, have lived in goat's hair tent. They're very, very durable. I could tell you a lot about that, but we won't for time. So it was over that linen layer with the screen in front of it. You can see it there as well. Over that was laid a layer of ram skins dyed red. I made them into squares because that's how they made them in ancient Egypt, was make them in squares. But you can see here a leather chariot cover dyed red. The thing about the dye of red was it was superior to all other dyes. Any other dye, green, blue, yellow, doesn't matter. It's like a paint that stays on top of the leather, and it becomes kind of fragile over time. It kind of cracks, but the red dye seeps into the leather and becomes one with the leather. So it was really it's a high quality. This is a high quality product. Of course, there are the rams. Of course, there's rams in ancient Egypt. There's goats in ancient Egypt. There's rams in ancient Egypt. So both of those materials were also found. And it was to go over top of the goat's hair layer. I want to be completely transparent. We don't have dimensions for it. I covered up the goat's hair layer following the example that the goat's hair layer covered the linen layer. So maybe the ram skins covered that. So you couldn't see it. But I don't have any indication of that because the text doesn't tell us what the dimensions were. So I can't tell you for sure. And of course, that's what it looked like with the screen on it. And then the outer layer was another layer of leather called tahas in Hebrew. Tahas leather, it could be a lot of different things. I made it bigger as well for the same reasons, but it's see badger skin. Sometimes in some translations, you'll see dolphin skin, sometimes dungon. Other times it's been translated as a color, sometimes goat hair again for some reason. I'm not sure why somebody think that. Some even think that means beaded work. There's a lot of different ideas for what the source animal is, but a scholar named Noonan did some work. He's an expert in ancient Egyptian language, and he came back to the Bible and looked at it and he said, Tahas, that's actually an Egyptian loan word. Just like some of these other words are Egyptian loan words, it actually means premium fine leather. It's the kind of leather you stretch and you let it cure and becomes very soft like a baby's skin. It's the kind of leather you used for the drums. It's the kind of leather you use for parchment when you want to write a scroll, very, very fine. If you were to buy you came to Andrews University Press and got an Andrews Study Bible, that's a premium fine leather. It's very soft leather that just kind of falls open. That's the kind of premium leather. It's very soft, supple leather, very expensive. That's what they use on the outside. And I think he's right. I think it means fine leather. Here you kind of see examples of leather tents in ancient Egypt. You can see that they're how it was used. I'm actually standing next to it. I think here I'm standing next to it in the Cairo Museum. It's now currently in the Civilization Museum. But they use this checkerboard pattern. That's why I use that same pattern when I made it. And I made it, of course, different than the other one as well. So thousands of pieces kind of stitched together, but it's this fine premium leather. So just to give you an idea, if you came into the sanctuary courtyard this is what you would see, something like this. Now, it's my imagination how this looks, but what you're looking at, let me tell you, you're looking at fine premium leather, which means on the very outside, the very most expensive, precious leather you can possibly make is the one covering the entire sanctuary of God. So it's not this kind of rustic tent, kind of hastily put together. It's a very valuable thing. And it tells them how special God is, how valuable God is, that this is going to be used to cover his tabernacle with. So the inside has this fine linen layer. The outside has a fine leather layer. And in between are two durable leathers. One's goat's hair that holds the weight. One's ram skins holding the weight of the leather above it. So the durable layers you can't see, but the very fine, special ones that tell you how valuable it is are the ones you would be able to see, which I think is very special for the sanctuary. Now let's go quickly through the furnishings. The first furnishing you're going to meet, of course, is the bronze altar. It's 5 cubits by 5 cubits by 3 cubits high, so it's about 5 feet high. So if you can imagine what 5 feet high is, probably up to my shoulders, 8.5 feet wide. So I can hold my hands out 6 feet wide. Remember, I showed you the pyramid. I don't know if you remember this from the first night, but a block in the pyramid. I had my hands out like this. My wingspan is about 6 feet. It was 8.5 feet. So it's bigger than that pyramid block that you saw. That's how big, that's how wide this was. It's a very, very large structure. Right there, I made it, I designed it, I drew it like an Egyptian style. Let me give you a close-up of it here in the next slide. Here, I used the same kind of footing that you'll find on the bottom of furnishings. It was made out of acacia wood, but this is overlaid with bronze, probably a thicker kind of bronze so that it could withstand the heat. You'll see this is a stone altar in the Temple of Karnak. You get the idea of the altars, how they would do the altars, and kind of have the place underneath we actually get the ash from. Well, on this one, the bronze altar, it had a poles that would go through with the rings, these cylinders that I told you about the ancient Egypt, use cylinders for rings. These are about midway up the sides. This is the same kind of style they would use for the paneling of it, and kind of this special molding along the top part of it there. And then it would drop down, and about halfway down was a metal grate. And so the wood would be on the inside of it with the animals about halfway from the top, and then the ash would fall down into the bottom part. I don't know if the bottom part was empty and it fell all the way down. We're not told, but somehow they obviously had to get the ash out, and they had different kinds of tools to get rid of ash. So we know that that was part of the process, even though we're not told exactly what they looked like. Bronze, by the way, was also relatively new in ancient Egypt. Here is a copper ingot. Copper is oftentimes was the older technology. The Hebrews gave quite a lot of this, quite a lot of tons of it. Here is a curling iron, tongs, and a trimmer that was used in ancient Egypt. So, if, ladies, you want to know how they curled their hair in ancient Egypt? That's how they did it. I don't know if there might be some guys that curl your hair. I don't want to be discriminatory. You might, if you do that, that's up to you. It's between you and God. And here is this copper. Copper was used at that color. This is brass. Brass wasn't used until the time of the Ptolemies. Again, this is the Greek period. So it was definitely not brass, but it could be bronze. It definitely could be bronze. Bronze was tin. It was new technology. The thing about it is that bronze is actually harder than copper. It can be sharpened to a finer point than copper, which is what made it good for weapons. And it actually had a lower melting temperature than copper, which made it ideal for working in the wilderness. By the way, here's a mirror made out of bronze, and a cat, of course. You can see that there. So the next furnishing was the laver. We actually have no dimensions for the laver. We always draw it circular, but there's nothing in the Bible that says it was circular. We call it circular because of Solomon's temple with the big C that he made that was massive. This might have been massive too. We really don't know. We don't have any dimensions for it. We do know that they used it to wash their feet and hands before they went in to the tabernacle so they could be pure. That's what it's used for. And ancient Egyptians had the same thing. They had this sacred pool. This is rectangular. Maybe the laver was rectangular. I drew it circular. Circular, and it has a base, by the way, also. There's two parts of it. Base is also made out of bronze. Solid bronze. This is not acacia wood. Solid bronze. And they use it to wash, purify themselves, be ritually pure. And the Egyptians did the same thing. So it'd be very common for them to understand what that means, why you have to be pure and clean. Remember, this is why I thought lice rather than gnats was the better translation for the plague, was the same kind of ritually pure concept. Inside the tabernacle, is the table. The table, by the way, I just want you to get the idea. The tabernacle is 17 feet tall. So just imagine the roof in your house is probably 8 to 10 feet, depending on how big your house is made. 17 feet is how tall the tabernacle ceiling is. So it goes up it's quite high. But the table was only 2.5 feet high. So just imagine where that comes up to about my waist. It's a small item. It's not big. So God is using something that's going to give a bigger kind of an idea of the grandness of God in the vastness. One thing I think the Roman Catholics do very well is that they're able to show or give the idea of the grandness of God by the size of their cathedrals. Now they go overboard, and we have a lot of problems with some things there. But one thing they do beautifully is that you walk into a temple or what do you call it, church, a basilica, and you look up and you're overwhelmed by the size of it. You know that the God you're worshiping is big. And I think this is part of what God was doing here, getting the idea of the bigness in this, and he made the furnishings very small. So the table is very small. On the Arch of Titus in Rome, there's actually a carving of them stealing. They took away, they destroyed the temple at Temple of Herod and in AD 70, and took back the items of furnishings there, not the ark, but the other ones. And you kind of have here and here, you see the table there, the golden lampstands. And so I drew a table very much like this table here. They also stored the trumpets with it. The trumpets were also stored with it. You see the trumpets stored here. So taking the trumpets. So I put the trumpets here as well. The trumpets are actually made out of silver, but we'll do gold first. Gold was, of course, obviously common in ancient Egypt. But there's something I want you to understand about gold. Gold was a monopoly of royalty. Common people, nobles, could not own gold unless the king gave it to them. Gold was considered to be the skin of the gods, and it was used for everything. So God took something that was an ancient Egyptian concept, the concept of gold being the skin of the gods. If you go into a tomb, into the burial chamber of a tomb, you'll see it's painted yellow. And the reason why it's painted yellow is because that's the realm of the god. The gods are, they dwell in the blue expanse of the sky, but their houses are made of gold. Their skin is made of gold. And that whole kind of God dwelling in something of gold, for some reason, the God of heaven chose to use that to express the concept that he was their God. Gold is exclusively used in the visible aspects of the tabernacle, which is very nice. Bronze was used exclusively in the visible aspects, also with some silver, I guess, in some of the perimeter parts of it. But bronze and some silver was used in the courtyard of the sanctuary. Gold itself in Egypt was used for many different things. Sometimes we think, well, how could they have given that much gold? They gave almost a ton of gold for the building of the sanctuary. But I just want you to understand that there's enormous amounts of gold. They always store the gold in the temples for the king. At Karnak, the Papyrus Harris tells us there were 2 solid gold obelisks. Together, those obelisks weighed 38 tons. Today, that would be worth $1.5 billion worth of gold just in those 2 gold obelisks. And the Hebrews only gave 1 ton. So yes, the Hebrews had a lot of gold, but there's a lot of gold left in Egypt. They didn't wipe out Egyptian gold. There was plenty of gold. Here's some gold slippers for a king. The king was buried with gold. There's so much gold. But gold in ancient Egypt was not the kind of gold you might think of. Most gold in ancient Egypt that was this electrum. It's kind of a mix of gold and silver together. It's kind of a little bit of pale gold. In fact, in the Amarna letters that were sent back to Akhenaten, I say after the Exodus, if it's in the 18th dynasty, it's after, but before if it was in the 19th dynasty. But Akhenaten, we see these letters at Amarna, his capital, from the Levant area, southern Palestine, telling, please help us. There are Semitic people invading our territory. Most of us think those are the Hebrews, the Israelites coming in during the time of the judges, Joshua and the judges. So the king is giving them gifts, but he's not coming and helping. And they're saying, well, why are you giving us all this worthless gold? Because he's sending them this pale electrum. See, what the Egyptians would do is they would make gold. I'm gonna go back 1 slide, 2 slides. You see this mask of Tutankhamun, how rosy gold it is? See this, these slippers, how rosy gold it looks? That's not the gold in ancient Egypt. This is the gold in ancient Egypt, kind of a pale color. So what they would do is they would take copper and they would mix copper with the gold to make it look like gold should look. And they make it look the kind of rosy gold. Well, God asked for them to give pure gold, gold as it comes out of the ground. I first thought pure gold meant gold refined gold, but they didn't refine gold in ancient Egypt until the time of the Babylonians. So they just didn't do it. So it had to be pure gold, has to mean gold as you take it out of the ground. In other words, don't change something to make it something for God to make it look how you want it to look. Leave it the way God makes it. I think it's a very important lesson for us. And so the gold that we're talking about is probably more this kind of a color rather than this kind of a color. Here you can see gold and a silver vase. This actually is a picture that was used, that was made for the wife of the third Tutmosis, who's also a candidate for Pharaoh of the Exodus. That's actually, this would have been used at the time of the Exodus or just before it. So kind of get an idea. But this was used, by the way, when the Hebrews were in Egypt. That item right there on the screen. Here's another one, libation vessel for the third wife of Tutmos. That was used at the time of the Exodus, so just before it, while the Hebrews were in Egypt. Silver, of course, was very, very common in ancient Egypt. In fact, during the Middle Kingdom, it was actually more valuable than gold, but it's about half the value of gold at the time of the New Kingdom. So silver, of course, was very, very common. In fact, later on, during the third intermediate period, a whole coffin was made out of silver. They used a lot of silver. Most of that silver was used just for those sockets for the tabernacle. I told you about that already. He also said, God said in Numbers 2, make 2 silver trumpets for yourself of hammered work. Well, in Tutankhamun's tomb, they found silver trumpets. Silver trumpets were used for the military to help them know when to move forward. The Numbers tells us that they used it to assemble for worship. Different blasts would tell you different things to rise up, get your tents prepared for moving because the cloud has moved up and we're about ready to move out. To move forward, it gave a signal. So they used the trumpets for signals. They did blow them, I think for the BBC or something, testing the sound, the note. It actually is the note C. It's close to the note C. But when they did it, they actually exploded the bell of the trumpet because it hadn't been used in forever. It's kind of sad that they did that. But if you want to hear what it sounds like, the recording is actually on YouTube. So just look it up and you can hear what the trumpet would sound like with a modern trumpeter blowing into this ancient trumpet. You kind of get an idea what the trumpets in the time of the Israelites would have sounded like. This is what it would have been. Well, across the table was the lampstand. Again, we have no dimensions at all for the lampstand, so we don't know what it looked like. I drew it like an Egyptian lamp. Oftentimes, we see this kind of menorah-looking shape here. It could very much have been looking like that. If it did look like this is a very unique item. Nothing like that exists in Egypt. Lampstands did exist in Egypt, and they were shaped something like this, but they were a little bit more decorated than that. And it would have been on a platform like this. So something like that. But just remember that the lampstand itself is not the lamps. It had lamps on them, but the lamps themselves were detached. And they would arrange the lamps and face the lamps toward the north. And each day they're supposed to come in and trim the wicks and fix those. I think I have a lamp. Let me look around real quick in my office. Yes, I have a lamp. This is not from the time period, but you can get an idea of what a lamp looks like. This is a reproduction of a lamp. It's not exactly from that time period, but you get the idea of a lamp. Their lamps would have probably been more open here and wouldn't have had this little tail on it. But they did have a place for the wick to come out, and if they were to arrange the lamps facing forward so the light would shine forward. So that would have been very interesting as you look at it. We don't know how tall it was, but the other furniture is all small, so it probably was also small. Then the golden altar, was also only about 3.5 feet tall. It was very, very small. But this is where they were going to burn their incense. I drew a picture of what, by the dimensions, what it would look like with the cylinders underneath it for the poles. This is what an incense burner looked like in ancient Egypt. And you can see one being used here, an incense burner, those kind of things being used. And so you kind of get an idea what the ancient Egyptians used for burning. That was outside the veil in the holy place. Then you go behind the veil, under the veil, inside the veil, and you find the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was probably about 2.5 feet tall. Again, not very tall, and about 4 feet long. Now, what I'm not clear about, and what I think nobody really knows, is do the cherubim count in that height? I don't think the cherubim count in the height. I think the cherubim were added to the top of it because there's the mercy seat. So I think it's talking just about the box, the chest element of the ark being 2.5 feet tall. You can get an idea of what it looks like here. I actually drew the wings of the cherubim as the ancient Egyptians did, one up, one down. But because of the way Ellen White describes them as using their two wings, one up and the other one up, touching in the middle, kind of covering the ark itself, the mercy seat, and the other wings kind of coming around and covering their bodies, I drew them kind of interlocked. I don't know if they were interlocked. That's just how I drew them. But you see in ancient Egypt, they always carried their gods on poles, and they also had boats for them. And then on those boats were the winged creatures with the name of the god in between that. Those winged creatures are actually goddesses themselves, and you can see how their heads are facing forward, looking at each other because they're gods. But what were the cherubim supposed to do on the mercy seat? Do you remember? Their eyes, their face was to be down. So God took an element of ancient Egypt and then he changed it because the cherubim themselves were not deities. The cherubim were angels serving God. And so he used something very Egyptian looking, but he changed it. And so it's in some of those changes that I noted those throughout my dissertation, some of those changes that they would recognize what this meant, but then by seeing the change, they realized something brand new. So God was teaching them through a language they understood, but changing it to help them understand a heavenly reality that was different than the ancient Egyptians. But the ancient Egyptians also used poles to carry them on, so they wouldn't touch them because they were sacred. The whole concept was very Egyptian looking. In fact, when I described the Ark of the Covenant to my professors in University College London, all secular professors, good people, they said, well, that has to have been written in Egypt. The book of Exodus could not have been written outside of Egypt because you would never see this outside of Egypt. You would never see something like this outside of Egypt. Even though you see the army go out, this never went with them. And the only way you ever see that is if you're actually in Egypt. And so that itself kind of argues, again, for Moses having been the one who wrote it, having been trained in Egypt and seen it in Egypt. Here's another one. You get an idea of another double-decker kind of idea here. Here's another one. This is Tutankhamun's tomb with Anubis on a sled with poles. Here's a reproduction of a boat. This is a boat of Amun. The god would be put in between here, like we see here, but also carried on poles in the sanctuary. Carrying on poles is what they did for noble people. You see a line drawing of someone being a very important person being carried on a chair. Here's an actual carrying chair. You see what it looked like? Here's a chest from Tutankhamun's tomb that actually has carrying poles on it. So the whole concept of carrying something that's important, sometimes even sacred, on poles, that gives the idea. So in other words, God's using this idea of carrying all this furniture, all these furnishings on poles, so you understand that they're not supposed to touch them. They're sacred and they're very important. Here again, you see the winged creature idea, but these are looking straight across because they're gods themselves, the god Nephthys and the god Isis there. And of course, here we have all of them together, drawn, by the way, to scale. So they're all drawn to scale, but not in the right, not maybe spread out this way scale, but just their different height. You can see how much bigger the altar was than some of the other items. And of course, we don't know how big this was, and we don't know how big this was. I just drew them small. All right, so let me just go through each of them. I'll peel back each of these layers so you can kind of see the furnishings inside as we peel back each of the layers that cover the tabernacle. There's the tabernacle itself, the frame. There's the inside, and there's the pulling back. And I actually lit the lights here, casting the light across the room, casting a shadow on the opposite side of gold. So the gold is reflecting back and forth. The gold altar is burning incense. The smoke rises up. I drew these pillars and a screen on the outside so there'd be a way for the smoke to get out. I don't know if it overlapped this way like I did it, but you can kind of get the idea. And I drew maybe the presence of God in between the cherubim on the mercy seat, just to kind of get an idea of what it would have maybe looked like with all the items there, the table of showbread and all those different things, the bowls and the things, just to get an idea. All right, so here's the end of it all. All 9 materials were definitely used in Egypt. In fact, 5 of them were brand new, which means that God introduced these technologies because he wanted to use them for the sanctuary. But at the very least, God used new technology to show how valuable and how special his tabernacle, his sanctuary was. Also, all 9 materials were only all available at this time. They were not available before, and they were not all available after. And that's something I thought was very special. It means that the text of the book of Exodus had to have been written shortly after the events. It could not have been written late. It had to have been written early. And so that's kind of nice. So not only were they all available, they were only all available. And the design does seem to follow Egyptian culture. There's a lot of design elements, although God seemed to change things. So God used the Egyptian culture, but he changed some things. And sometimes maybe the lampstand is a new thing, maybe introduce some new things as well to it. So as you look at the Egyptian military camp, there's a sacred space, a real domestic space, a military space. It seems like God had his sanctuary made like an Egyptian military camp, at least with that concept. And so that's how I think it was made. During my defense, we talked a little bit about this, and some things that came out that I thought were very special. One thing that came out that we talked about was the context. Hebrews 8:4-5. I believe Paul wrote that. Paul said, "For if he were on earth, he would not be a priest." This is talking about Jesus. "Since there are priests who offer the gifts according to the law, who serve the copy and shadow of the heavenly things, as Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle. For he said, 'See that you make all things according to the pattern shown you on the mountain.'" Obviously, he was referring back to Exodus 25, where he said, "Make the tabernacle according to the pattern I'm going to show you." So the question we have to ask ourselves is if it's a copy and a shadow of heavenly things, how much of a copy, how much of a shadow is it? There's a heavenly reality. There's a heavenly sanctuary, but is the throne of God a golden box made of acacia wood overlaid with gold, with 2 gold cherubim poking him in his sides? Or is that a symbol of his throne that's a reality? And the throne is the reality in heaven, with the covering cherubim, of whom Michael and Gabriel, or one of Lucifer at one point was. Is that the reality in heaven? And is this supposed to help us understand what's happening in heaven? The sanctuary, the heavenly sanctuary, is real. But the earthly sanctuary is made as a copy, as a shadow of it. I tend to lean towards that, and the pattern God showed him was a pattern that the Hebrews would understand. Because I believe God speaks in a language we understand. I believe when he showed Daniel scrolls being opened in heaven when the judgment was seated, I don't think scrolls are made out of dead plants and dead animals. I don't think there's dead plants and dead animals in heaven. But I think God showed Daniel something he would understand. I think when God showed his throne to Ezekiel, and he saw a very Assyrian, Mesopotamian looking throne, wheels and wheels, but then he showed his same throne to John, there's a very Roman looking stone throne. So I think God shows people based on their culture, so he can speak in a language they can understand. He contextualizes us so we can understand, because God cares more about understanding than anything else. If God cared about setting the record straight, he wouldn't have used gold, because the Egyptians said gold was the skin of the gods. He would have used something else. But God wants to communicate. And that's what I see throughout my entire study, God wanting to communicate. And so how does he want to communicate? Well, I believe he wants to communicate heavenly concepts to the Hebrews in a language they could understand. They just came out of Egypt. Every person who came out of Egypt was born in Egypt. Everyone grew up in Egypt, so much so that Ellen White in the chapter on Moses says that by the time of the Exodus, the Hebrews had lost all knowledge of who God was. And God had to reintroduce himself. That's why he wanted to dwell among them, to show them who he really was. Dr. Fortin at my defense also brought this out. He said, do you remember when they hired Balaam to curse the Hebrews? And he did it 4 different times. But this isn't Hebrews, by the way. This is actually Numbers. I think I had the wrong text on the screen. I can give you the right text later. I think I fixed this on another screen, but I missed this one. Sorry, it's actually Numbers. So in Numbers, he comes to curse the Hebrews, and he says, he has not observed iniquity in Jacob, nor has he seen wickedness in Israel. Yahweh is his God. Yahweh his God is with him, and the shout of a king is among them. How would Balaam know that Yahweh his God was with him and a king was among them, unless he looked down and saw the sanctuary and recognized what looked very much like an Egyptian military camp, with the way the Hebrews were all camped by their armies, and the sanctuary in the middle looking very much like the center part of an Egyptian camp with Ramses, the way Ramses had it. And he looked down and said, I know exactly what it was. In other words, Dr. Fortin thought, and I think he's right, that God wanted to communicate not just to the Hebrews, but he wanted to communicate to the surrounding nations of his presence, just in the same way he used the plagues to redeem the Hebrews and to redeem the Egyptians. I think God is always trying to communicate and redeem more than just us. Sometimes he's just talking to us. He wants to talk to everybody. That's who God is. He wants everyone to be saved. And I think God's talking to us today. I think because we can understand the materials used and why those materials were used and what God was trying to communicate, now we can better understand the sanctuary and how God was able to communicate with us today. Why does God put us through trials? What the things that happened at Mount Sinai, the things that happened later on. If I get a chance in the future to do, I have actually one more presentation. I could come back another time later and do one more presentation and talk about the golden calf and these things. But God puts us through trials for a reason. If you want to know the answer, I think to why God puts us through trials, I think the book of Daniel tells us that. It's actually in Daniel 11. This isn't up on the screen. I'll just read it for you. Daniel 11, 35. Actually, you recognize Daniel 11 as being the King of the North and South chapter. We get confused. We get all wrapped up in King of the North and the South. But here in verse 35, he's talking about God's people who are persecuted, God's people who go through trouble, who fall. And he's answering the reason why they fall. In Daniel 11:35, it says, and some of those with understanding, those are God's people, shall fall. Why? To refine them, to purify them, and to make them white until the time of the end, because that's still for the appointed time. Sometimes we wonder why we have to go through trials in life, and the answer really is to get us ready for the end of time. It's to purify us, it's to refine us, it's to make us white. And if I get a chance to come back sometime, we'll talk some more about that in more detail. But we'll open it up now to questions.
Wow. Well, to actually think about time, I know I was asking Dr. Baker to come on a Saturday night, but he won't be able to. So if you guys are okay, are you okay Monday night, Doctor? I'm not saying we should. I'm just wondering if you're okay with that.
Let me look real quick.
Because it is a 7 presentation series.
I can, yes. I can do it Monday night.
Okay. So we've had the same people usually this whole time. So I'll let you guys comment whether you can come in, whether we can be there on Monday. And if we can't, we can always try to find another time.
Yeah, and just you can send me an email too and let me know what you decide.
Yeah, absolutely. Now that's a wow for me. That is another one of those eye openers, especially about the sanctuary. Now, I don't know if anybody else has a question first, but if you do, just raise your hand. I try to see on the whole screen, but for me, okay, there's a question by Don. Go ahead, Don. Why don't you start us off?
In the construction of the sanctuary, they moved this sanctuary quite a few times. They had to take that completely apart, piece by piece, and then set it up. That is monumental.
Yeah. It's monumental, and it's also heavy. Obviously, using carts, oxen, mostly to probably pull some of those heavier things. The furnishings were all carried by the Kohathites, but everything else was probably put into different carts and wagons. And Book of Numbers tells us about that, how they transported it all. But yeah. In fact, if you want to look more into how they did it, they actually was very systematically organized. It's a beautiful thing. They did it in a way so that as the armies went, the first 3 armies went, and then the tabernacle, the coverings, all that would go. A couple more tribes would go, and then the furnishings would come later. So that by the time there were so many Hebrews that you saw how much was complicated there. By the time the sanctuary furnishings arrived in camp, everything had already been set up. That's how many Hebrews there were. So when people talk about small numbers of Hebrews, they're often not reading the text quite clearly enough. There were quite a lot of them to get there. So it's monumental. Correct.
Yes. Thank you.
All right, go ahead, either Todd or Cherry. You have your hand up.
Yeah, there was some place, and I don't remember where I read it, that mystery leather, somebody said it was seal skin.
Yeah, there's been a lot. There's been a lot of debate through the years about what source animal was used, um, and a lot of that goes back. We can thank Martin Luther for the beginning to do that. Martin Luther was translating. He was one of the first to translate a Bible. He wasn't the first, but he was among them who translated into German. And in doing so, he didn't know what animal it was. He didn't know what Tajas meant, but it sounded a lot like a German word for badger, and so that's what he decided to call it. And so that's why you see badger skin in the King James and the New King James, just copying what Martin Luther did. That's my understanding of how that came about. But there's been a lot of suggestions by other people since then. Not a lot that made sense to me. Number one, those kind of leathers, they did exist in Egypt. Exotic leathers did exist, but they were very rare. And I can't see God using unclean animal skins on his sanctuary. That just didn't, a tabernacle, that just didn't make a lot of sense to me. And so to use a cow leather or a sheep or ram leather and make it fine leather, that's actually, that word matches up with the Egyptian words. And there's a lot of Egyptian loan words. That made a lot more sense to me, and it also showed the value of it by still keeping a clean animal, source animal. So that's why I kind of shy away from the others. But yeah, I think there's a lot of good explanations about that, but I don't really buy a lot of those source animal arguments.
Okay.
Yeah. That's just me though.
All right. Glad was asking on chat. Just wanted to clarify that there's not an exact measurement for the lampstands. Did I hear you correctly that it was not very big?
So there's not a measurement given in the Bible for how the dimensions of the lampstands. We don't have it. We don't have it for the laver either. So those are the two furnishings we don't have. Both, by the way, made of pure gold for the lampstand and pure bronze for the laver. So what I did is I just drew it small like the other furnishings, but it could have been much bigger. And we really just don't have any idea. We don't have any idea.
Okay. Mom, you had a question?
Yes. Um,
Mom, you're cutting in and out. We can't hear you at all. Is there?
the Egyptian camp, there is a similarity with the tabernacle of God?
Mom, we didn't
Is there
hear
a
it.
similar?
Yeah, we didn't hear your question.
I said, is
Go ahead. Start from the beginning if you can.
my question is, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. It's a little better
Can
now.
you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Did I hear it right that the camp of the Egyptian has a similarity with the camp with the tabernacle of God or the sanctuary of God?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it matches up very well. The dimensions, the shape of it being rectangle, the idea of an army being camped around, like you can see here in this picture here, the army is camped around this central structure here, which is, by the way, in my dissertation, I tested this. I don't want to convert cubits to feet or inches or meters or anything. I just took ratios because you can compare ratios to ratios. So it doesn't matter what unit of measure you're using if the ratio is the same, and the ratio of the sanctuary is the same ratio you see used here. So and it was used in the other drawings as well. So it seems to me, at least on the superficial perspective, that God very much could have used that. However he did it, he definitely put his sanctuary in the middle of the armies of Israel. So he did put his army camp around the sanctuary. And because so many elements seem to match very well, including this long room and then a canopy smaller room with the winged creatures here, it seems to match up well with the Egyptian military camp, which by the way would have made sense the Hebrews themselves building 2 Egyptian military supply cities. So they would have known the Egyptian military, and they would have understood. I see God is trying to communicate. And when I see God doing it like this, it seems to me he's trying to communicate to them that he is their God and he's their king. He's their God king in the way Pharaoh was, only obviously on a much bigger scale than Pharaoh, just having proven that in the plagues. And so I think he's trying to communicate to them in this way to help them understand his importance. Yeah.
All right. I don't see any other questions, but I have a few. First one is
Thank you.
you mentioned that the sanctuary was made in a form of Egyptian camp.
Yes.
Now, since our theology is based on the sanctuary on earth is very much like the sanctuary in heaven, which I know can be confusing because the 3 sanctuaries have wholly different dimensions, whether it be the sanctuary, and I think you brought up that because of the thinking of people were different in each of the era. How would you connect the two? That there is a sanctuary in heaven that God says, I want you to make the sanctuary like the one in heaven. And yet it looks like an Egyptian camp. Is there a tension there that you kind of looked into?
So I was on a beach when I was doing my dissertation. I was on the beach here in Andrews, in Lake Michigan, with my wife, and she actually asked, I think, probably one of the best questions, like on this very same topic. And she said, "Why would God take them out of Egypt and then use Egyptian culture to make His sanctuary?" And I thought that was that is the question, isn't it? And yet you see over and over again God using embroidery, which was exclusively used for royalty in Egypt, using the 3 different colors for thread that were exclusively used for royalty. He's using gold, which is exclusively used for gods. It's reserved for royalty. And he's doing all these things, including the Ark of the Covenant with these winged creatures. He's doing everything that looks very much like Egypt. Why would he do that? And this goes back to your question and back to the question your mother just had. And I think this is one of the beautiful things about God. We oftentimes, I think growing up, at least I can talk for myself, I grew up in a Sabbath school class that I love the stories of the Bible. When I got older, I got to be a teenager, I read the stories in the Bible for myself, and I realized how sanitized those Bible stories were made, appropriately so, by the way, for children.
Right.
Some of those stories they skip. I mean, Uncle Arthur's Bible story, he skips right over them. He doesn't even talk about them because they're so lurid. There's some things made for adults and there's some things made for children, and I think that's very appropriate. But I think at some point we have to understand that God is more willing about communicating than He is anything else, and so He's willing to do certain things that are unusual. I always point out that in Psalms it mentions that God makes the antelope for the lion to eat. And I think about how death is so unnatural for God. If we didn't know about death, we would say, no, God would never do something where He would purposely create an animal to die for another animal. But if He didn't, the lion would die because the lion has to eat. Sin has made the life we live in so wrong from the universe God has intended us to be in, that He's had to do some things that are outside of His nature in order to have us survive and live, and even willing to do certain things like this. And so when Solomon builds his temple, Solomon's temple, he does it in different dimensions. He puts doors on the most holy place. He makes a bunch of lampstands. He makes a bunch of he makes this gigantic sea for the laver, and puts these creatures, 12 of them, holding it up. And he makes things completely different than the sanctuary in the wilderness. Yet God doesn't scold him for any of that. It's all fine. He makes 2 giant statues of cherubim and puts them in the most holy place. Giant statues, images, which doesn't the 10 Commandments say you're not supposed to do that? But Solomon did it, and God didn't. God filled the tabernacle. He was happy to dwell there. So sometimes God is more willing about communicating than He is correcting. Now about the heavenly sanctuary, I think sometimes maybe we get this idea. I've had the same idea. I grew up in the church, by the way. I've heard this a million times, that the heavenly sanctuary, that God patterned the Bible says this, patterned the wilderness sanctuary after the heavenly sanctuary. But unless we think it's a one for one, in other words, the throne of God has to be the ark, and it's that size. It's small like that. It's it's got the gold cherubim with their heads down. It's on. In other words, God made it very Egyptian looking, but in heaven. So that means maybe Satan copied it on earth. Maybe it's possible. I don't think God's throne is the ark. I don't think it looks like the Ark of the Covenant. I think the Ark of the Covenant represents God's throne. So in other words, I think when it says a copy and a shadow, it's referring to something that it's patterned after, but it doesn't have to be the exact same. The pattern, the things that happen in it are all patterned exactly after what happens in heaven, but the way he communicated to them was unique for the Hebrews context, which is obviously an Egyptian context. That's how I explain it.
Awesome. I don't see anybody else. So I really like that whole army thing, and I need to contemplate about that because it shows that this whole concept of God wanting to have things or preparing us for battle, to actually have that in the design of sanctuary or church. I know as a pastor that's kind of my biggest thing, is trying to get our members to think, hey, we're not here to sit on pews. We really are in a war zone. And you just brought something up that I need some time to just really regurgitate for a while, because that's pretty good.
Oh, we sing Onward Christian Soldiers. We sing March to Zion. We talk about having crusades. We don't say the word crusade anymore because it's offensive to Muslims. We understand that, so we try to say evangelistic efforts and that kind of thing instead. But we used to use the word campaign because we understood that it's a battle. We're in a battle, and I think that is a very healthy thing to understand. That this is, as Paul wrote in Ephesians, we're not fighting against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. And that's why we're told to put on the whole armor of God. He literally says armor of God before and after talking about the principalities and powers. Yeah.
Right. No, that's great. Todd, or Cherry, you had a question as well?
Yeah, I had a question. When you were talking about the sanctuary and there was I thought you said pillars going up, that the smoke went out. I thought the smoke went out went over the curtain into the holy place. That's what the most holy place.
Most holy place, right? Right. So so it did go over. It says it goes over the curtain or the veil into the most holy place. If it's a canopy that causes some troubles, that's one of the issues with the canopy. It just depends on what that means. But smoke goes up, and so at some point there's going to be an awful lot of smoke, and it's going to be super smoky in there. There's no way for the smoke to escape, especially because it has 4 covering layers. So the only way for it to escape is probably back out through the screen. So either the screen is short, so the smoke can eventually waft over and then come back out. It's got to come out somewhere. Or it's going to be very smoky inside that room. So that's why I drew it the way I drew it. But again, you don't hold me to it, because I don't. There's 5 pillars that were used at the screen, and the screen was hung on it. But we're not given the dimensions of the pillars, or we're not given the dimensions of the screen. So we don't know exactly how big they were. We just know that it blocked the view. So beyond that, we don't know much. Everything else is speculation at that point.
Okay, thank you.
That's actually a very good observation about that going over. That's what it's intended to do. But what happens after that? I think one thing about the canopy that I like, the canopy idea for the veil, is you think about all the blood that's once a year put up on the veil. Or I don't know if it's every day or whatever. It's every day it's put up on the veil, and then it's supposed to be cleaned off once a year. That's a lot of dried blood on the veil. But if your canopy can keep rotating around, you have a chance to have a fresh one every so often. I'm not sure how that would work, but anyway, it's another one of those concepts. These are kind of some of those things that I think is it in Patriarchs and Prophets. I think it's one of the first couple of chapters toward the end. Ellen White says something about sanctified imagination. It's okay as long as you don't go ahead of the Bible. So as long as we're careful, we're staying inside the Bible, we can have some fun topics and discussions about how these things looked and worked. I think it's kind of fun to talk about those kind of things.
Yeah, you brought out something tonight that I never even thought about is these long poles.
Hmm.
And you said about how the Israelites must have brought them uh, to build their own houses.
Hmm.
And obviously, at this point, we don't know where they got the poles. Because, like you said, we need to many times use our sanctified imagination. So, in my mind, I'm wondering whether God at some point told them, yeah, just bring this huge poles. Because trying to carry something that long is so much harder than just to chop it up and build. Unless somebody wanted to build a huge, either really tall house or a really long house, so to speak. So I know for me that whole concept of these guys were carrying all of this across the desert, to build houses in Canaan that probably had trees to begin with. But how would they know, right? They've
Right.
all they've been to is in Egypt. I guess for me, again, it's one of those things where I wonder if your whether there are other options to them bringing this long other than, all right, we're going to build houses, because the disconnect for me is they're only supposed to be in the wilderness for a few weeks at the
Right.
most, or a few months at the most.
Yeah.
And that's not exactly where they're going to build their house.
No.
And if they're going to go to Canaan, you would think that God was going to put them in a place that had trees. So is it possible that God just said, just bring long poles? I won't tell you exactly what it's for. And then somewhere in the desert, we're just going to put this whole thing together, and kind of go that way, that
Yeah,
route.
so my professors in my defense of my dissertation suggested, and it is no way to prove it. One of the great things about these topics is there's no way to prove it one way or the other.
Right, right.
Currently, there's absolutely no evidence for a species of acacia tall enough in Sinai Peninsula that they could have cut down there at Mount Sinai. So they had to have brought them with them, or unless there were trees and we just haven't found the evidence yet, which is always a possibility. It's possible there were more forests, a taller acacia nicotica could have existed in Sinai. We just have no evidence anywhere of it, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist. They could have done it there. The reason why I said that is because when you build a house, you build it out of stone with stone walls in the Levant area, mud brick in Egypt, because they don't have stone there that really used that way. They didn't do that. They did stone for temples and tombs, but not for houses. But in Palestine, the Levant area where they were going, they used stone, but they used wood for beams across the top for roofs. And since they'd already cut them, they'd already been building these back in Egypt. My mind was, why cut something twice? If you're going to be a month from now, you've already been all the labor of cutting down a tree, stripping the bark off, making boards. And making boards in the ancient world wasn't like turn the buzz saw on and let's go through the sawmill. They didn't have that. You were cutting it by hand. That's a lot of work, and to do that all over again when you get to that just seemed like we've done a lot of work already. Why do it all over again? Let's just take it with us. And they did take those big looms with them. They almost certainly had to have taken those 5 meter, that's 25 feet looms. Now those can be broken down, but they took those big things with them because your profession, your whole life has been weaving for the Egyptians. Well, I have this skill. When I get to where we're going, maybe I can make my life out of this and just keep doing it. Obviously, these women were very skilled. The Bible tells us they were very skilled in the book of Exodus, there, chapter 35, somewhere in that area. So, yeah, maybe they took them with them. Maybe God told them to take it with them. Maybe there was trees in Sinai that they cut down. I'm not sure. There's a lot of different options.
Awesome. Well, like I said, you've brought us a whole lot of things to talk about. If nobody is opposed to it, let's plan for Monday. If you enjoyed the last 6 days, you're going to enjoy this one as well. And if you are opposed to it and don't want to say anything, just text me one way or the other, and I will let Dr. Baker know. But as for now, let's plan on it. That way we get the whole series. The other thing too is usually, okay, there's Todd. Why don't you, Todd or Cherry?
Yeah. Are we going to be using this Zoom or
Yes.
our Bible study Zoom?
Yes. No. This is we're going to be using the exact same Zoom.
Okay. All right. Just wanted to make sure.
Right. And like I said, for the most part, I think this has been I'm gonna text Kay and Kathy because they're usually also the ones that are are with us. Now, before we end, usually when Dr. Baker presents, there's always a line wanting to, I don't know, shake his hand, tell him that they appreciate him. We can't do that. And I know it's this is the first time he's also done a series in Zoom. So there's definitely one of those challenges. One of them is usually when he tells his jokes, the people are laughing. Sometimes they groan. I've heard a groan or two,
Very
but
appropriate.
they that interaction I know can be tough sometimes when you're speaking. So before I pray, this is the last time for any of you to say something to him. Actually, if you don't say it now, you can say it on Monday. I just forgot we're having one more meeting on Monday, so maybe we can plan on that so he gets to hear it from you as well. I know Gladys and I have told him how much we appreciate him, and I think he would appreciate it hearing it from all of you as well. So let's plan it for Monday. Let me unrecord. Hang on one second.